Oh, I'm so tired from yesterday. It was kind of a late night. I was actually really impressed with the night footage. I thought everything was actually going to be super dark where you can't see it, but it actually turned out really well. Now, this is actually what I wanted to talk about yesterday, but there wasn't enough time. It's actually called the Study of the Unmanned Air Vehicle Regulations and Interim Report. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is actually the report that the government used before they brought out those interim laws for the drone. So I thought, hey, this might be interesting to read so we can actually get some, well, sort of official answers as to how they came up with the conclusions that they did. So I'll actually link it below, so some of you might actually want to read it as I go along, because I'm only going to cover the points that kind of, I guess, make sense to me, or ones that I would personally focus on. And again, like if you're like, say, an expert in privacy or whatever, you'd probably find other points more interesting. But for me, these are the most interesting points so far. My personal assumption before is that there wasn't many regular, everyday people who had input on these rules, whereas probably more large organizations, commercial businesses. And reading points like these, for example, like it says the ALPA spokesperson recommended that recreational users should adhere to established guidelines concerning flying UAVs at low altitude. Basically, they say here as an example, as a site at least 9 kilometers away from aerodromes. So this kind of tells you where these opinions or recommendations came from. Again, it came from more, I guess you can say, not the actual drone recreational users per se, as opposed to the larger organizations, the pilots, basically from my view, people who don't really have experience in using drones, which is, I guess, is a kind of confirmation of that. And it even goes on further to say, for example, the NAV Canada also expressed support for the minimal distances from aerodromes, which is, in this case, 9 kilometers away. Again, it just doesn't seem like they used everyday people to voice their opinions. So for a person like me, I think that shows even more reason why we should be making more content, supporting like the messages from, you know, just from an everyday people, showing how we use drones to capture footages and all that. I mean, you guys, even some of you mentioned it yourselves, like in the comments, when it comes to like, say, people who do have the ability to change the rules directly, where it's not until they actually see the drones, like the type of work they can produce, like even if it's like for fun artistically, that's when they stop and realize like, wow, this thing, maybe there's, you know, maybe there's some good to it. Is it right to ban all this stuff? So I think actually, you know, one way is to create more content in many ways. And that's something like a regular person like me can do, as long as I can, quote, find some place to actually fly it at this point, which is the main challenge. The more I think about that, because even from my personal experience, a lot of people that are anti-drone or afraid of it have a completely different tune when they actually see the work that's produced. Like even in my examples with the hiking, there's a lot of people that were, quote, anti-drone before, but until they actually got involved, they saw the spectacular footages that can be produced, then they kind of changed their tune, saying, okay, well, maybe these things aren't as bad as people say they are. So that's actually another thing to think about, where if a person like myself doesn't have a lot of vocal representation just because it's too political, then maybe that's another way to do it too. Just produce really compelling content where even the everyday person would appreciate it, to the point where they would wonder, why are you stopping this person from being able to do stuff like that for fun? That's kind of the opposite way of getting representation in a very political process in many ways. Actually, it reminds me of even like athletes, for example, or artists. It's kind of the other way around, where you're making compelling, great content and great work, where it's kind of like the saying of people say, be so good that they can't ignore you. So I can imagine if someone out there actually did create some spectacular drone footage that everyone can relate with, identify with, to the point where they want to tell everybody about it, I can easily see that being as a good catalyst to be the voice in many ways too. Because I know there's a lot of petitions and groups that are starting up in many ways, but I think that's actually a good way to do it as well. Because I even said again before, like video is a pretty powerful medium in many ways for people to be able to relate and to tell your message. I thought this one was interesting too, because it essentially says they before proposed that instead of differentiating a difference between a commercial and recreational user as to what guidelines or laws one should follow, that they should change it to risk-based. So basically that's kind of what we see now. because they see all drones, for example, as quote risk-based to crash into an airplane or something like that, then everyone is treated the same. In my opinion, that's a huge error because you're assuming everyone's going to be operating in the exact same way as well. And that's just not the case. Like for me, a person like me, I'm not flying near an airport. I'm not flying like a super heavy drone or anything like that. I'm flying, you know, in the open area, like let's say here right now again. I mean, honestly, what is the huge risk compared to someone flying near an airport? In my opinion, it's a huge difference. Otherwise, in my opinion, it's kind of like saying, hey, if we're trying to manage cars and vehicles on the road, let's do it all risk-based, where technically, if you think about it, someone riding a bicycle could equally smash into a car, cause like chaos and so forth. So still, it's risk-based, so that bike is gonna have to be treated exactly in every single way like a car, where that bike needs to get a license, that bike needs to go through automotive training. To me, that doesn't make sense because it's completely different. Actually, this beyond visual line of sight, I believe that's what it stands for, it actually makes a lot of sense, where it's suggested that you'd have to consider that that plays an important part in terms of someone flying, because what it means by that is the rules, I believe right now, is when you're flying like say a drone, you have to always keep line of sight on it. Although in many cases it doesn't make sense, even though we have like say the monitor to look at the screen. I mean, let's say I'm flying between this thing right now. Technically, if I'm going in a circle, I can't see it anymore in my line of sight if I'm spinning in a circle, but I can see it on my screen. So doesn't it make more sense to have laws saying you have to somehow be able to see your drone, whether it be through this screen or yourself? Because just to say, hey, the fact that you can't see it right away, it's going to be illegal, makes no sense. And I think in this thing, it's actually trying to make that point where in many industries, it says here like mining and forestry, it actually doesn't make sense to have always the line of sight. Basically, things like looking at the screen should be considered, which in my opinion actually makes a lot of sense, and that would be a step forward as well. Privacy issues were a point too, but I agree with the point saying basically there are already general privacy issues for, say, people that are stalking you or whatever you want to call it with cameras and so forth on private property. So there isn't really any need to make more for a drone user, which in my opinion, that makes more sense. I mean, if there's already a law that forbids people from doing various things in private properties and so forth, then a drone shouldn't be any different than someone using any other sort of camera as an example. At the same time, there's like kind of the argument where a lot of the drones, the cameras, are more for, say, wide angle shots as opposed to really zooming in to spy on someone. And that's a good point to bring up too, because to make something specific for a drone, actually it doesn't make sense, because by the time you pass the law, it probably makes it a lot more difficult to get rid of it afterwards. So it's better to get it right now. So hopefully they're on the right track. But again, I think that comes down to if more people create content, bring out their voices, then more odds that this thing won't go through like that. Again, there's more there, so I encourage you guys to read it over as well. But to me, it kind of reinforces the thoughts I had before, where a lot of the laws were made without proper representation of the people that actually fly the drones, as an example. Or at the same time, it's basically a knee-jerk reaction because they don't know what they're talking about in many ways. They're basically relying on third-party information, and because a lot of that third-party information are from, say, non-casual recreational drone flyers like myself, like for the most part, it seems like they're opting to go with the view that they're comfortable with, if that makes sense. So they're more used to aviation, traditional forms of flying, so with that, they're basically agreeing with those rules. Although it makes me really curious, because if things like that privacy really is a violation of one's right, what happens if over the months, for example, there were people putting their full names and address on their drones where for some reason someone's information got compromised that way, and then afterwards it was deemed, hey, the government shouldn't have been allowed to do this because it's unconstitutional or whatever. So would the government be held accountable afterwards for everyone who's been compromised that way? Like, that's kind of interesting, and it makes me wonder if there is any validity to that. How about you guys? Have you read this? How do you feel about it? Any points that you think are specific that should be mentioned? Do you think this basically confirms why things are the way they are? Or do you think there were points brought up, for example, that they just decided to ignore just for personal bias? Usually don't like reading things that are this formal usually, but I guess I have no choice in the sense that I have to in many ways study this to see what's going on. Alright, other than that, see you guys later.